The autumn moon hung heavy over the Appalachian wilderness, casting silver light through the ancient canopy of elderwood forest. Somewhere in the distance, wolves were singing their voices, rising in celebration and joy, in the sacred recognition of destiny fulfilled. The choosing ceremony had begun. Lysandra Winterstone stood alone at the edge of silver pine-packed territory, her breath forming small clouds in the October air. Pale hair caught the moonlight like captured starlight, and her slender frame was wrapped tight in a worn woolen cloak that had belonged to her mother. Behind her, barely visible through the trees, torches burned bright around the ceremonial grounds. She could hear them, her packmates laughing and calling out as bonds snapped into place, as wolves found their destined mates under the blessing of the full moon. She had not been invited to stand among them. Lysandra closed her eyes against the ache in her chest, that hollow place that seemed to grow larger with each passing year. 22 years old, and she had never been chosen for anything. Not for the ceremony, not for a pack position, not even for the simple kindness of inclusion. Her wolf was small, they said, weak. Her bloodline was common, unremarkable, tainted by her mother's strange healing gifts that the pack elders whispered were more witchcraft than wolf magic. Alpha Garrett had made his decree 3 days prior, standing before the assembled pack, with his chest puffed out and his voice carrying that particular tone of absolute authority that alphas used when they wanted no arguments. You will not attend the choosing, Lysandra. Your presence would be an insult to those worthy of recognition. Your wolf is defective, your lineage questionable. The moon goddess does not waste her blessings on the broken. No one had spoken in her defense. Not a single voice had been raised in protest. They had simply nodded, accepting his words as truth, as law, as the natural order of things. And Lysandra had bowed her head and accepted it too, because what else could she do? Fight against the judgment of an entire pack, argue that she deserved what they all agreed she did not. So she had come here instead, to the deep forest where the sounds of celebration were distant enough to be almost bearable, where she could pretend that the joy echoing through the trees belonged to a different world entirely, one that had nothing to do with her. The night air smelled of pine and approaching winter, of earth and wildness, and that particular crispness that came to the mountains in October. Lysandra pulled her cloak tighter and turned away from the distant torches, walking deeper into the forest, away from the life that had never truly wanted her, away from the pack that saw her as nothing more than a burden to be tolerated. Her mother had died when Lysandra was 12, taken by a fever that her healing gifts could cure in others, but somehow could not touch in herself. Her father had vanished 2 years later, simply walked into the forest one day and never returned. The pack had searched for 3 days before giving up, declaring him lost to rogues or his own foolishness. Lysandra had been left alone, surviving on the edges of pack life, invisible, except when someone needed her mother's healing touch, and remembered that the daughter had inherited the gift. She had learned to be small, to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to accept the scraps of kindness when they came and to expect nothing more, to bury her dreams so deep that even she sometimes forgot they existed. But tonight those dreams ached like fresh wounds. The forest grew thicker around her as she walked, the underbrush dense with mountain laurel and the gnarled roots of ancient oaks. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The moon tracked her progress through gaps in the canopy, patient and eternal, and utterly indifferent to the small heartbreaks happening in its light. Lysandra had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the forest, low and rough and threaded through with pain. A grown human or wolf, she could not tell, but it was close and it was suffering, and every instinct in her omega nature pulled her toward it with an urgency that bordered on compulsion. She moved through the underbrush without thinking, her body following the sound, before her mind could question the wisdom of approaching an unknown, injured wolf in the deep forest. Her mother's training was bone deep, now automatic. Someone was hurt. That was all that mattered. The clearing appeared suddenly, a small open space at the base of an enormous oak tree that had to be 300 years old if it was a day. And there, crumpled against the massive trunk like discarded laundry, was a man. He was old, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair that fell across a weathered face twisted in agony. His clothes were torn and soaked with blood, dark stains spreading across fabric that had once been fine quality. Deep claw marks raked across his chest, vicious and deliberate. His left leg was twisted at an angle that made Lysandra's stomach clench. But even in his broken state, there was something about him. Something in the set of his shoulders, the line of his jaw that spoke of dignity and command. This was not a man accustomed to lying helpless in the dirt. Lysandra rushed to his side, dropping to her knees in the damp earth without hesitation. Her hands were already moving, assessing, cataloging injuries with the practiced efficiency her mother had drilled into her. Broken ribs, definitely. Possible punctured lung. The leg would need to be set. The claw marks were deep but clean, no sign of infection yet, though that would change if they were not treated soon. The man's eyes fluttered open as her fingers probed gently at his wounds. They were pale blue, startlingly alert despite his obvious pain, and they fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pause. "Please," Lysandra whispered, her voice soft but urgent. "Let me help you." The old man studied her for a long moment, and something flickered in his gaze. Recognition, almost though they had never met. Wonder, perhaps. And beneath it all, a bone-deep weariness that went far beyond physical injury. "You should run," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "They might come back." "Who?" Lysandra asked, already tearing strips from her cloak to make bandages. She had nothing else, no supplies, but she would make do. She always made do. "Rogues," the word came out on a gasp as she pressed fabric against the worst of the bleeding. "Hunting for something they will never find." Lysandra did not waste time with more questions. Her mother had taught her that healing began with action, not words. She worked quickly, her touch gentle but sure, cleaning what she could with water from her flask and binding the wounds with strips of her cloak. The man watched her work, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "What is your name?" he asked as she fashioned a makeshift splint for his leg using branches and more fabric. "Lysandra. Lysandra Winterstone." She met his eyes briefly before returning to her task. "And you?" The old man hesitated just for a heartbeat. "Call me Marcus." As Lysandra worked through the night, she did not notice the way Marcus watched her with a mixture of wonder and grief. She did not see how his eyes widened when she began to hum softly an old healing song her mother had taught her, the melody rising and falling like a lullaby. She could not know that this song, this exact melody with these exact words, was the same one his beloved mate had sung decades ago before death had taken her and broken him. She could not know that this old man, lying broken in the forest, was Marcus Ironheart, the former Alphaking who had vanished without a trace 3 years prior, leaving his son to rule a kingdom, drowning in confusion and grief. Marcus had fled after his mate Luna's death, unable to bear the weight of leadership without her steady presence at his side. He had wandered lost and purposeless, trying to outrun his pain and his guilt. And tonight he had nearly died for it. But Marcus said nothing of his true identity. Something deep in his gut, some instinct honed by decades of ruling, told him that this girl, this rejected Omega with kindness in her eyes and her mother's healing touch, was exactly where fate needed her to be. And if he revealed who he was too soon, if he disrupted the delicate threads that destiny was weaving, everything might unravel before it had a chance to begin. So he remained silent, and he let her work, and he wondered at the strange paths that had led them both to this clearing on this particular night. "Why are you out here alone?" Marcus asked, as Lysandra helped him drink from her water flask, supporting his head with careful hands. "On the night of a choosing ceremony, no less. I can hear the celebrations from here." Pain flickered across Lysandra's delicate features, there and gone so quickly that Marcus almost missed it. "I was not chosen to attend." "Impossible," Marcus said, and there was steel in his voice despite his weakness. "You are of age, yea, are you not? Does not matter when you are considered defective." Lysandra's voice was barely above a whisper. "My wolf is small, weak. I have no family name of importance, no strength to offer a mate. The pack decided I was not worthy of the ceremony." Marcus's jaw tightened with barely concealed anger. For a moment, the old king showed through the mask of the wounded wanderer, and the force of his conviction made Lysandra look up in surprise. "Then your pack are fools," he said flatly. Lysandra stared at him, this broken old man, who somehow carried himself like nobility even while bleeding into the forest floor. For a heartbeat, she saw past his injuries to something else, something regal and commanding, as if he had spent a lifetime being obeyed. "You have a good heart," Marcus continued, his voice softening. "That matters more than strength." "Not in our world," Lysandra said sadly. "But thank you for saying so." She helped Marcus into a more comfortable position against the oak tree, fashioning a cushion from leaves and her remaining cloak. The night grew deeper around them, the air colder, and the sounds of the ceremony faded into silence as the newly bonded pairs ran off into the forest in joy and celebration. Lysandra blinked back tears she refused to shed. Somewhere out there, wolves were discovering their perfect matches, their other halves, the ones the moon goddess had chosen specifically for them. And here she sat, tending to a stranger's wounds, as alone as she had ever been. "Will you stay with me tonight?" Marcus asked gently. "I do not think I should be moved until morning, and I would feel safer with you here." The truth was, Marcus could have healed himself. As the former Alpha King, his abilities were formidable even in his advanced years and wounded state. But something told him this girl needed purpose as much as he needed to observe her, to understand what fate was so clearly orchestrating in this clearing beneath the October moon. Of course, Lysandra agreed without hesitation. She had nowhere else to be, no one waiting for her return. She gathered dry wood with practiced efficiency and built a small fire, her movements sure and economical. Soon warmth bloomed between them, pushing back the autumn cold and casting dancing shadows across the massive oak. They talked through the night, an unlikely pair bound by circumstance and something neither of them quite understood yet. Marcus asked her about her life, and Lysandra found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. Her loneliness, her dreams of belonging somewhere, of mattering to someone, her secret hope that there was a place in the world where her gentleness was valued instead of scorned, where her healing gifts were seen as strength rather than weakness. "Tell me about your family," Lysandra said as dawn approached, turning the eastern sky soft shades of rose and gold. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of their fire. "I had a son once," he said finally. "Strong, determined, everything an alpha should be. But I left him when he needed me most. And I do not know if he will ever forgive me." "Why did you leave?" "I was lost." The words came out rough, scraped, raw by grief that 3 years had not diminished. "My mate had died, and I could not bear the weight of leadership without her. So I ran like a coward. And I have been wandering ever since, trying to find a reason to go back." Lysandra reached out and gently squeezed his weathered hand. Her touch was warm, solid, real. "It is not too late, you know, to go home. I am sure your son misses you more than you realize." Marcus looked at this young woman who had been rejected and cast aside by her own pack, who had every reason to be bitter and hard, yet still had faith in reconciliation and love, who still believed that broken things could be mended. "How can you be so certain?" he asked. "Because that is what love is." Lysandra said simply, "It endures even when we think it is gone, even when we are sure we have destroyed it. Love waits." As the first full light of morning broke through the trees, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold, Marcus made a decision that would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. "Come with me, Lysandra." She looked up from where she was checking his bandages, surprise clear on her face. "Would I know a place where you would be welcome, where your gifts would be valued? Come with me to the royal court." Lysandra's eyes widened. "The royal court? Your son works there?" Marcus smiled, a mysterious expression that held secrets and hope in equal measure. "Something like that. Will you come? I am too injured to make the journey alone. And I think fate brought us together for a reason." Lysandra looked back towards Silver Pine Pack territory, toward the life that had never wanted her, the pack that would not even notice she was gone. Then she looked at this kind old man who had seen value in her when no one else did, who spoke to her as if her words mattered, as if she mattered. "Yes," she said quietly, "I will come with you." They set out at midday after Lysandra had returned to her small cottage on the very edge of pack territory to gather supplies. It was barely more than a shack, really, one room with a fireplace and a mattress and shelves lined with her mother's old healing herbs. She took what little she owned, everything that mattered, fitting easily into a worn canvas bag. No one saw her leave. No one came to say goodbye. She was a ghost in her own home, and her disappearing changed nothing for those who had never truly seen her in the first place. The journey to the royal court would take 3 days through the mountain wilderness, following old trails that wound between peaks still capped with early snow. Marcus's injuries were severe enough that they had to move slowly, and Lysandra supported much of his weight as they walked, her small frame proving stronger than it looked. She redressed his wounds each evening when they made camp, applying poultices made from herbs she gathered along the trail, checking for signs of infection that never came. She fed him, kept his spirits up with quiet conversation, and never once complained about their slow pace or the difficulty of supporting an injured man through rough terrain. And Marcus, in turn, observed everything about her. The way she noticed small beauties that others would miss. A bird's nest woven with strips of silver birch bark. A patch of late-blooming asters, purple and gold against the green. The pattern of morning frost on a stream like nature's own lacework. The way she was endlessly patient with his limitations, adjusting their pace without comment, when he struggled finding level ground without making it obvious she was doing so. The way her eyes held both deep sadness and stubborn hope, a combination that should have been impossible, but somehow was not. Yes, Marcus thought as he watched her gather firewood on their second evening, moving through the forest with unconscious grace. She was exactly what his son needed, even if the boy did not know it yet, even if he would fight it with every fiber of his being. On the first day of their journey, as they followed a ridge trail with views that stretched for miles across the Blue Haze Mountains, Marcus began to teach her. "You see that valley," he said, pointing to a depression between two peaks. "What does it tell you?" Lysandra studied the landscape with serious attention. "The trees are different there. Darker green, evergreens, where the rest is deciduous. Which means the soil is different, or the water." "Good. And what else?" She looked more carefully. "There is no smoke, no signs of habitation. Either it is too remote, or there is a reason people avoid it. Both, actually." Marcus smiled. "That valley floods every spring. The old-growth pines survive it, but nothing else can take root. A wolf unfamiliar with these mountains might see shelter there and end up trapped when the snowmelt comes." "You are teaching me to read the land," Lysandra said. "I am teaching you to survive. There is a difference." By the second day, Marcus had moved on to more complex lessons. They sat by their campfire that evening, and he drew a map in the dirt with a stick marking territories and boundaries. "The kingdom is not just the royal pack," he explained. "It is an alliance of dozens of territories, each with their own alpha, their own traditions, their own pride. Keeping them unified requires understanding what each one values most. Some respect only strength. Others prize wisdom or wealth or ancient bloodlines." "How do you lead wolves who value such different things?" Lysandra asked. "You give each one what they need while never losing sight of what the whole requires." Marcus looked at her intently. A good leader knows when to be commanding and when to listen. The mistake most alphas make is thinking leadership is only about dominance. "What else is it about service?" Marcus said simply. "A true king serves his people, not the other way around. But that is a lesson many never learn." "Your son," Lysandra said carefully. "Does he know this?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "He is learning. He became king too young, thrust into a role he was not quite ready for. And he carries it alone because I was too broken to stay and help him bear the weight." That third day, as they descended from the high country into the foothills, Marcus's teachings took on a different tone. "The rogues who attacked me," he said as they walked, "they were not random bandits." Lysandra glanced at him, reading the seriousness in his expression. "What were they? Organized, military trained. They moved in formation, communicated with hand signals. And they were searching for something specific." "What information?" Marcus said. "Or perhaps an artifact." "I was carrying something when they attacked. Something I had hidden away 3 years ago. Something that powerful people would very much like to find. Did they get it? No. I hid it before they came. But they suspect I know where it is, which makes me a target. And anyone traveling with me becomes a target as well." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I am giving you this choice now before we go further. You can turn back, return to your pack. I will give you enough coin to start somewhere new if you wish, somewhere far from the danger that follows me." Lysandra met his pale blue eyes steadily. "I am already coming with you. I do not abandon people who need help, even when helping might get you killed. Especially then." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have your mother's courage. That will serve you well in what is coming." "What is coming?" "Change," Marcus said simply. "For all of us." As they crested the final hill on the third evening and the valley opened up before them, Lysandra gasped. The royal court rose from the landscape like something from a dream, all white stone and soaring towers that caught the last rays of sunlight and threw them back in shades of amber and rose. The palace itself was massive, built in the style of the great mountain lodges, but scaled up to impossible grandeur, with walls that gleamed and windows that reflected the sky. Around it, the royal pack's territory spread out in a vast protected haven forests and meadows and small villages, all enclosed within ancient stone walls that spoke of centuries of habitation. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was everything Lysandra had never imagined she would see. "It is beautiful," she breathed. "It is home," Marcus said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Or it was once. They made their way down the hillside as twilight fell, the palace growing larger with each step. Guards spotted them at the outer perimeter, and Marcus lowered the hood that had hidden his face for the last 3 days. The reaction was instant and explosive. The guards stared for one frozen moment, then erupted into shouts. Some ran toward them, others sprinted back toward the palace. Within minutes, they were surrounded by warriors, all of them staring at Marcus as if seeing a ghost rise from the grave. Former King Marcus, one of the guards, breathed, his voice shaking. "You are alive. The Alphaking thought we all thought you were dead." "I know what you thought," Marcus said gently, and there was deep sorrow in his voice. "And I am sorry for the pain my absence caused. But I am here now, and I need to see my son. Immediately." "Right away, sir." The guard's eyes shifted to Lysandra, who stood slightly behind Marcus, overwhelmed by the attention and the sudden reality of where she was. "But who is this?" "This is Lysandra Winterstone," Marcus said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "She saved my life and escorted me home safely when I was wounded and alone. She is to be treated as an honored guest of the crown. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." They were escorted through the massive gates and into the palace grounds. Lysandra had never felt so small, so utterly out of place. Everyone who passed stared at her, this unknown Omega in worn traveling clothes standing beside the lost king. She kept her eyes down, reverting automatically to the submissive behavior Silverpine Pack had trained into her over 22 years. Marcus noticed and squeezed her shoulder gently. "You belong here, Lysandra. Do not let anyone make you feel otherwise." Before she could respond, the very air in the entrance hall seemed to change. It grew heavy, charged with a presence so powerful that Lysandra's wolf instinctively lowered itself in her mind, recognizing an alpha dominance far beyond anything she had ever encountered. She looked up and forgot how to breathe. A man was striding toward them through the parting crowd, and he was the most magnificent thing Lysandra had ever seen. Tall, perhaps 6'4", with a warrior's build that spoke of brutal training and harder battles. Black hair fell past his shoulders in waves, and his face was framed by a thick beard that only emphasized the stark masculine beauty of his features. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. Gray as storm clouds, intense, burning, with an emotion so complex that Lysandra could not begin to parse it. Joy and anger and grief and relief all warring for dominance. This was Alpha King Dominic Ironheart, and his presence filled the entrance hall like thunder before a storm. Father Dominic said, his voice low and rough with barely controlled emotion. 3 years. 3 years you were gunning, and now you appear like a ghost at my gates," Dominic Marcus began. But his son held up a hand. "We will talk, but not here. Not now." Dominic's gaze moved to Lysandra for the first time, and the impact nearly sent her to her knees. Something flickered in those gray depths, something that made Lysandra's wolf stir with interest, despite her fear and confusion. The world seemed to tilt sideways, and for one impossible moment she felt it. Recognition, connection, destiny. It struck like lightning, bypassing thought entirely and going straight to the soul. "Mine," her wolf whispered with absolute certainty. "Ours." And in Dominic's eyes, just for a heartbeat, she saw the exact same recognition reflected back at her. Saw his pupils dilate, his entire body go rigid with shock. Felt the invisible threads snap into place between them. Then his face closed down, became a mask of cold courtesy, and the moment shattered. "Who is this, Dominic?" asked his voice, carefully neutral. "Lysandra Winterstone." Marcus answered when Lysandra seemed incapable of speech. "She saved my life when rogues attacked me in Elderwood Forest. I owe her everything." Dominic studied Lysandra with an intensity that made her skin flush and her heart race. He saw everything in that one long look. Her worn clothing, her Omega status, her beauty that was soft and understated rather than bold. He saw her kindness in the way she stayed close to his father despite her obvious fear of him. He saw her strength in the proud lift of her chin, even as she trembled under his scrutiny. and something in Dominic Ironheart's carefully controlled world shifted on its axis. "Welcome to the royal court, Lysandra Winterstone," he said, his voice slightly softer than it had been. "You have my gratitude for protecting what is precious to me. You will want for nothing during your stay here." "Thank you, Alphaking," Lysandra managed, her voice barely audible. Dominic's gaze lingered on her for one moment longer, and in that look, Lysandra felt the heat of their connection pulling at her, calling to something deep in her chest. Then he turned sharply and strode away, his hair flowing behind him like a dark banner, the crowd parting before him like water before a ship's prow. Lysandra realized she had been holding her breath. "That is your son," she whispered to Marcus, her legs suddenly unsteady. Marcus looked at her with knowing eyes, reading everything in her face that she was trying desperately to hide. "Yes, and I have a feeling, my dear, that your story is only just beginning." Lysandra was given a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire cottage back in Silver Pine Pack territory. The chambers occupied a corner tower with windows that looked out over the mountain range, offering views that stretched for miles across peaks that faded into blue haze at the horizon. The floors were polished hardwood, covered with thick rugs woven in patterns of silver and blue. The furniture was carved from dark wood, elegant and substantial, and the bed was so large and soft that Lysandra stood staring at it for a full minute, convinced it must be meant for someone else. Servants drew her a bath in a marble tub so deep she could sink up to her chin in water that smelled of lavender and mountain herbs. They brought her food on silver trays, more food than she could eat in a week, let alone one meal. And they laid out clothing, a silk nightgown so fine that Lysandra was afraid to touch it, certain her rough hands would snag the delicate fabric. She bathed carefully, scrubbing away 3 days of travel and the lingering scent of forest and campfire smoke. She stood afterward in front of the gilded mirror in the bathing room and barely recognized her reflection. Her pale hair, clean and brushed, fell in waves past her shoulders. Her skin, free of dirt and exhaustion, was fair as moonlight. Her blue eyes, wide with wonder, looked too large in her delicate face. She looked like someone who might belong in a place like this. But she knew the truth. She was still just Lysandra Winterstone, the rejected Omega, the girl no one wanted. Fine clothes and marble bathrooms could not change that fundamental reality. She ate alone in her rooms, too overwhelmed to face the grand dining hall where Marcus had told her the court took their meals. The food was exquisite, rich, and perfectly prepared, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. Her mind kept returning to those few seconds in the entrance hall when Dominic's gaze had met hers and the world had tilted on its axis. The connection between them. She had felt it clear as daylight, undeniable as gravity. That instant recognition that said, this is the one the moon goddess chose for you, the other half of your soul. But Dominic had felt it too. She had seen the shock in his expression, the rigid tension in his body. And then he had shut it down, locked it away behind walls of ice and courtesy, and dismissed her as if she were nothing more than a stranger who had done his father a service. Why did he not want a mate, or did he simply not want her? Lysandra climbed into the enormous bed, wearing the silk nightgown, and lay staring at the ceiling, watching shadows from the fireplace dance across carved beams. Sleep would not come. Her mind was too full, her heart too confused, the pull toward Dominic aching in her chest like a physical wound, even though he was somewhere else in this vast palace, probably not thinking about her at all. She was still awake when a soft knock came at her door near midnight. Lysandra wrapped a robe around herself and opened the door to find Marcus standing there looking far better than he had any right to after his injuries. The royal healers had tended to him properly, she could see, and he stood straighter now. The color returned to his face. "Cannot sleep either?" he asked with a knowing smile that suggested he understood exactly why. "The bed is too soft," Lysandra said, which was both true and a complete evasion of her real thoughts. "Walk with me," Marcus offered his arm. "I will show you the palace gardens. They are beautiful by moonlight, and I find I have missed them terribly." They walked through quiet corridors lined with portraits of former kings and queens, through halls where their footsteps echoed on marble floors. Servants bowed as they passed, and guards nodded respectfully to Marcus, and Lysandra felt utterly out of place in her borrowed robe and bare feet. The gardens, when they finally reached them, stole whatever breath Lysandra had managed to hold on to. They spread out in terraced levels, descending from the palace in a cascade of carefully tended beauty. Flowers bloomed everywhere despite the October chill, protected by the palace's ancient wards, their colors muted to shades of silver and blue glow in the moonlight. Fountains sang their eternal songs, the water catching the light like liquid mercury. Paths wound between hedges shaped into fantastic forms, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and night-blooming jasmine. It was the most beautiful thing Lysandra had ever seen. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following paths that Marcus clearly knew by heart, until they reached a circular courtyard with a fountain carved from white marble at its center. Water flowed from the outstretched hands of a stone woman whose face was serene and timeless. Marcus, Lysandra said finally, unable to hold the question back any longer. "Who exactly is your son?" Marcus turned to her with gentle eyes. "I think you already know." "The Alpha King," Lysandra whispered. "Your son is Dominic Ironheart, the Alpha King of all the packs in this region. And I called him something like a guard when you said he worked at the royal court." Marcus chuckled softly. He probably found that refreshing. Everyone treats him like he is more god than man. It gets tiresome, I imagine. "Why did you not tell me?" "Would you have come if you had known?" Lysandra considered this and realized he was right. She would have been too afraid, too certain that she did not belong anywhere near such power and responsibility. "Probably not," she admitted. "I knew you needed to be here," Marcus said. "And I think my son needs you too, though he does not know it yet." "What do you mean?" But Marcus just smiled mysteriously. "Give it time, my dear. Fate has a way of revealing itself." They walked in silence for a while longer, until a deep voice broke through the quiet like a stone dropping into still water. "Father, I should have known I would find you avoiding your rest." Dominic emerged from shadows near the fountain, and Lysandra's heart stuttered in her chest. He had changed from his formal attire into simple black clothing that somehow made him look even more imposing. His hair was loose around his shoulders, catching the moonlight, and his beard was damp, as if he had recently washed. He looked like some ancient warrior king from legend, beautiful and terrible, and utterly overwhelming. Dominic, Marcus said warmly, "I was just showing Lysandra the gardens." "I see." Dominic's gaze moved to Lysandra, and again she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing against her skin, making it hard to breathe. "Do you like them?" "They are beautiful, Alpha King," Lysandra managed, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "I have never seen flowers bloom in winter before." "The palace wards make many impossible things possible," Dominic said, and there was something in his tone she could not quite identify. "And you may call me Dominic when we are in private. Any friend of my father's is welcome to dispense with formality. I could not possibly call you by your given name. It would be improper." "I insist." There was command in his voice now, the natural authority of an alpha who expected to be obeyed without question. Dominic, then Lysandra agreed quietly, the name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue. Marcus watched this exchange with barely hidden satisfaction, his eyes moving between them like someone watching pieces fall into place on a game board. "I think I will retire now," he announced, though his injuries had clearly stopped bothering him hours ago. "My old bones are making themselves known. Lysandra, will you be all right finding your way back?" It was a transparent excuse to leave them alone, and all three of them knew it. Lysandra wanted to protest, wanted to beg Marcus not to abandon her here with this man who made her feel things she had no right to feel. But Marcus was already walking away, disappearing down a garden path with a speed that belied his supposed exhaustion. Silence stretched between them, not entirely comfortable. Dominic moved to the fountain and sat on its edge, gesturing for Lysandra to join him. After a moment's hesitation, she did careful to keep a proper distance between them. "Tell me how you found my father," Dominic said, so Lysandra told him. About the choosing ceremony she had been barred from attending. About hearing Marcus's cries for help in the forest. About caring for him through the night and agreeing to escort him home when he could not travel alone. She left out the depth of her own pain, the loneliness that had driven her into the deep forest in the first place. But she suspected Dominic heard it anyway in the things she did not say. "Your pack rejected you from the ceremony," Dominic said when she finished, and his voice had gone cold in a way that made the temperature around them seem to drop several degrees. "On what grounds I am weak, Alpha Dominic? My wolf is small, and I have no family connections, no strength to offer a mate. They decided I was not worthy of participating. And you accepted this judgment." There was no criticism in his question, only genuine curiosity. "What choice did I have?" Lysandra asked simply. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fountain's flowing water, as if it held answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, reflective. My mother was an Omega. Did you know that? Lysandra's eyes widened in shock. No, I did not. The strongest Alpha in 5 generations chose an Omega for his mate. Dominic continued, and there was profound grief woven through his words, like gold thread through dark fabric, because he recognized that strength comes in many forms. My mother was the gentlest, kindest person I ever knew. But when it came to protecting her family, she became something else entirely. Something unstoppable. She taught me that dominance is not the only measure of worth. She sounds wonderful, Lysandra said softly. She was. Grief flickered across Dominic's handsome features, raw and unguarded for just a moment, before he locked it away again. When she died, my father broke. He could not bear ruling without her, so he left. For 3 years I have led our people while wondering if he was dead or alive, if he abandoned us by choice or was taken by force. Lysandra heard the pain beneath his words, the loneliness that echoed her own in different but equally profound ways. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her small hand over his larger scarred one where it rested on the fountain's edge. The moment their skin touched electricity, shot through them both. The tie between them flared to life like a struck match, sudden and brilliant and absolutely undeniable. Lysandra gasped and Dominic's entire body went rigid. Through their connection, she felt everything. His shock, his longing, his desperate, terrified need to pull away before this went any further. Dominic jerked his hand back as if burned, rising to his feet so quickly that Lysandra flinched. I should let you rest, he said, his voice tight with control that was fraying at the edges. Thank you for bringing my father home, Lysandra. Your service to the crown will not be forgotten. He strode away before she could respond, his long legs eating up the distance, his posture rigid with tension. Within seconds, he had disappeared into the shadows between the hedges, leaving Lysandra alone by the fountain, confused and hurt by his sudden coldness. She could still feel the warmth where his hand had been under hers, could still feel the echo of that profound connection humming through her bones. Had she imagined it? Had she somehow offended him? Lysandra made her way back to her rooms with a heavy heart, convinced that she had already failed in this new world, just as she had failed in her old one. The palace corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, and she got lost twice before a kind servant pointed her in the right direction. But in his own chambers on the opposite side of the palace, Dominic paced like a caged animal, his wolf clawing at his consciousness with desperate urgency. Mate, his wolf snarled over and over like a prayer or a curse. Ours. Go back. Claim her. Protect her. Make her ours. Dominic had built walls around his heart for 3 years, told himself he did not need or want a mate, convinced himself that his duty to his people was enough. He had attended dozens of choosing ceremonies, had been present when hundreds of wolves found their destined bonds, and never once had he felt even a flicker of recognition. He had resigned himself to ruling alone, focused entirely on being the king his people needed. And then Lysandra Winterstone had appeared at his father's side, this slip of a girl with pale hair and blue eyes, and the connection had struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. One look. That was all it had taken. One meeting of eyes across a crowded entrance hall, and 3 years of careful control had nearly shattered. He could not do this. He could not burden her with the weight of being his queen, with the constant politics and danger and scrutiny that came with that position. She deserved better than a life spent in the shadow of a throne, better than a mate who was more monster than man when it came to protecting his kingdom. She deserved gentleness and peace and safety. Not him. So Dominic made a decision. He would keep his distance. It was better for both of them. Kinder in the long run, even if it felt like tearing his own heart out. But fate, as Marcus could have told him, rarely cares about what we think is better. The next few days passed in a strange limbo for Lysandra. Marcus was often closeted with Dominic, working through 3 years of separation and pain, slowly rebuilding the relationship that Marcus's disappearance had fractured. Lysandra was given free run of the palace and treated with careful respect by the staff, but she felt adrift, purposeless, a stranger in a world she did not understand. And she kept seeing Dominic. At meals in the grand dining hall, where he sat at the head table, and she was placed among visiting dignitaries far enough away that they could not speak, but close enough that she felt his presence like heat from a fire. In corridors, where they would round a corner and nearly collide, and Dominic would nod politely and murmur a greeting before striding past as if she meant nothing. In the gardens, where she sometimes caught glimpses of him walking alone late at night, his shoulders bowed under invisible weight. He was always polite, always courteous, always utterly devastatingly distant. It should not have hurt. He was the Alpha King, and she was nobody. Of course, he had more important concerns than one rescued Omega. But the pull toward him ached in her chest like a bruise that would not heal. And every time Dominic looked through her as if she were made of glass, something inside Lysandra cracked a little more. On the third night, unable to sleep yet again, Lysandra found herself wandering the palace halls. She discovered the war room by accident, drawn by lamplight, spilling from beneath a heavy oak door. The room was empty now, the council having dispersed hours ago, but the table remained covered with maps and reports. Lysandra knew she should not be here. This was not her place, not her concern. But something pulled her forward, some instinct she could not name. The maps showed the kingdom's territories marked with symbols she did not fully understand. But the reports were written in clear language, detailing rogue attacks across various pacts, dates, locations, casualty counts, patterns of destruction. Lysandra spread them out, her healer's mind, organizing the information automatically. And as the candles burned lower, she saw it, a pattern the warriors had missed. The attacks were not random raids on easy targets. They circled specific locations, forming a rough spiral that tightened with each successive assault. And those locations, when she cross-referenced them with the older maps pushed to the side of the table, corresponded to ancient sites. Places marked on century-old charts but ignored on newer ones. Places where something valuable might be hidden. Her hands trembled as she traced the pattern with her finger. This was not mere banditry. This was a search. Someone was looking for something, and they were getting systematically closer to finding it. Lysandra worked through the night, comparing maps, noting patterns, her mind racing. By dawn, she had filled 3 pages with observations, connections, possibilities. And she had a terrible suspicion about what the rogues were really searching for. She found Marcus at breakfast, pulling him aside with an urgency that made his eyebrows rise. "The attacks," Lysandra said quietly, "they are not random. I spent last night in the war room and I found a pattern. They are searching for something at specific locations. Old sites, hidden places." Marcus's face went pale. "Show me." They returned to the war room together and Lysandra laid out her findings. Marcus studied the maps with growing alarm, then placed his finger on one location that sat at the center of the spiral pattern. "Blackstone Ridge," he said quietly. "That is where I hid it. The Steelborn Ledger. What is that evidence? Names of every wolf who has betrayed the kingdom over the past 15 years. Proof of conspiracy, of treason, of murder. I compiled it before I left, before I knew who I could trust. And then I ran instead of using it." Marcus looked at Lysandra with something like awe. "You found this pattern in one night. Our best tacticians have been studying these reports for weeks. I have always been good at seeing connections," Lysandra said. "My mother said I had a mind for puzzles." Before Marcus could respond, the door swung open and Dominic strode in, followed by Commander Hayes and several other senior warriors. They stopped short at seeing Lysandra and Marcus at the war table. "Father, what are you doing here at this hour?" Dominic's eyes moved to Lysandra, and she saw confusion there and something else. Curiosity, perhaps. "Lysandra found something our war council missed," Marcus said. "Show them." So Lysandra explained her findings, pointing out the spiral pattern, the correlation with ancient sites, the systematic nature of the search. The warriors listened with growing attention, and Commander Hayes, a grizzled man, with silver threading his dark hair, studied the maps with new eyes. "The girl is right," Hayes said finally. "These are not random attacks. They are reconnaissance missions. Someone is looking for something specific." "The Steelborn Ledger," Marcus confirmed. "I hid it at Blackstone Ridge 3 years ago. It contains names of traitors, proof of conspiracy. If they find it before we do, they will know who has been exposed and who remains hidden." Dominic's expression had gone thunderous. "You have known about this evidence for 3 years and said nothing. I wanted you to have time with your mate before burdening you with this," Marcus said quietly, then caught himself. His eyes flicked to Lysandra. I wanted you to have time before she knows." Dominic interrupted, his voice flat. "We all know. The question is what we do about it now. We need to retrieve the ledger," Hayes said, "before the rogues find it." "I will go," Marcus offered. "It is my responsibility." No, Lysandra heard herself say. Every head in the room turned to stare at her. She straightened her spine, refusing to be cowed. They are hunting for you, Marcus. They will expect you to go after it, but they would never expect an Omega. Absolutely not, Dominic said, and there was steel in his voice. I am not sending my... He stopped himself. You are a guest under my protection. I will not send you into danger. You are not sending me anywhere, Lysandra replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I am volunteering. Think about it strategically, Dominic. The traitors are watching for Marcus or for you. A newly arrived Omega traveling with a senior warrior to deliver healing supplies to a distant pack. No one would give us a second glance. She is right, Hayes said slowly. It would be the last thing they would expect. I will go with her. Hayes continued, his weathered face thoughtful. Keep her safe. Make sure she gets back in one piece. And the girl has already proven she can handle herself. She found a pattern our entire war council missed. Dominic looked torn between pride in Lysandra's courage and terror at the thought of her in danger. His hands clenched at his sides, and Lysandra could see the war playing out across his features. I do not like this, Dominic said finally. You do not have to like it, Lysandra replied gently. But it is the right tactical decision, and you know it. Dominic pulled her aside away from the others, his voice dropping low. If anything happens to you, he said, his gray eyes burning into hers, I will burn the world down. The intensity in his voice, the barely concealed fear, made Lysandra's heart skip. This was not the distant, courteous king. This was something raw and real. Then make sure Hayes is well equipped to keep me safe, she said softly. The mission was planned for the following day. Lysandra and Hayes would travel light and fast, posing as a commander escorting a healer to a distant pack. They would retrieve the ledger from its hiding place at Blackstone Ridge and return before anyone realized they had left the palace. That night, Lysandra could not sleep. She paced her rooms, checking and rechecking her supplies, running through the plan in her mind. A soft knock at her door near midnight made her jump. Dominic stood in the hallway, still dressed, looking as if he had not slept either. May I come in? He asked. Lysandra stepped aside and Dominic entered her chambers. He moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit mountains, his broad shoulders tense. I should not be here, he said. It is not proper for me to be in your rooms alone. But I needed to see you before you left, to say things I should have said days ago. He turned to face her, and Lysandra saw vulnerability in his expression that took her breath away. I felt it, Dominic said quietly. The moment I saw you in that entrance hall, the recognition, the pull. Everything my wolf screamed at me that you were mine, that you were meant for me. Lysandra's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. I have been fighting it, Dominic continued, because I am terrified. My mother died and it destroyed my father. It destroyed our family. I cannot bear the thought of loving someone that deeply and losing them. So I told myself it was better to keep my distance, better to protect you from the danger of being connected to me. But watching you volunteer for this mission, seeing your courage, your intelligence, your determination to help, even when you owe us nothing. He stopped, running a hand through his hair. I realize that I am not protecting you by pushing you away. I am just being a coward. You are not a coward, Lysandra said softly. You are afraid. There is a difference, I am afraid, Dominic agreed. But I am more afraid of losing you without ever telling you how I feel. So I am telling you now before you leave. I felt the connection between us. I feel it every moment. And if you come back safely, when I come back, Lysandra corrected. When you come back, Dominic amended, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I would very much like to stop fighting what we both feel. If you are willing, I am willing, Lysandra whispered. I have been willing since the moment I saw you. Dominic crossed the room in 2 strides and cupped her face in his large hands, his touch infinitely gentle. Promise me you will be careful. Promise me you will come back. I promise, Lysandra said. I have too much to come back to now. He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that for a long moment, breathing together, feeling the rightness of their connection settling into place. When Dominic finally left her room, Lysandra felt something shift inside her chest. Fear for the mission ahead, yes, but also hope, purpose, and something that felt very much like the beginning of love. Lysandra and Hayes left at dawn, riding hard through mountain trails, that wound between peaks still capped with early snow. Hayes was a man of few words, but his presence was reassuring, steady, and competent. He taught her hand signals for silent communication and showed her how to move quietly through the forest. "You are a natural," Hayes commented on their first evening as they made camp. Most court ladies would be complaining about the cold and the rough ground by now. "I am not a court lady," Lysandra said. "I am just an Omega who knows how to survive." "You are more than that," Hayes said, meeting her eyes across the campfire. "The men are talking, about how you found the pattern in the attack reports, about how you volunteered for this mission. You are earning their respect." "That is not easy to do. I am not trying to earn anything," Lysandra replied. "I am just trying to help. I know. That is why it matters." On the second day, they reached Blackstone Ridge, a formation of dark stone that jutted from the mountainside like a broken tooth. The cave entrance was hidden behind a waterfall, exactly where Marcus had said it would be. "Stay alert," Hayes murmured as they entered the cave system. "If the traders have found this place, they might have left guards." They moved through the caves with drawn weapons. Lysandra's heart pounding, every sense heightened. The ledger was hidden in a chamber deep in the mountain, sealed in a waterproof case and tucked into a crevice in the stone. Lysandra's fingers had just closed around the case when she heard it. The scrape of boots on stone. The whisper of steel leaving scabbards. They had walked into a trap. "Go," Hayes commanded, pushing Lysandra toward a secondary exit. "I will hold them. I am not leaving you." "You are the queen's." He stopped himself. "You are more important than one old soldier. Now run." But Lysandra had not come this far, had not found her strength and her purpose, only to abandon someone who had shown her kindness. She stepped forward, the ledger clutched to her chest, and drew on power she had not known she possessed. "Stop," she commanded, her voice ringing with authority that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and primal. The rogues froze their wolves, responding instinctively to the Omega command that only the most powerful could wield. And in that moment of hesitation, Hayes struck his sword, flashing in the dim light, driving the attackers back. Then a figure stepped from the deeper shadows, and Lysandra's blood ran cold. Lord Victor Ashford, one of Dominic's senior advisors, smiled at her with poisonous satisfaction. Lysandra had seen him at court, had noted something wrong in his scent, but had not understood what it meant. "The Omega and the old soldier," Victor said smoothly. "How convenient. I had hoped Marcus would come himself, but this will do nicely." "You are the traitor," Lysandra said, understanding flooding through her. "One of them," Victor corrected. "Did you really think there was only one? We are everywhere, little Omega. In the court, in the packs, in places you would never suspect. And that ledger you are holding will die with you." The fight that followed was brief and brutal. Hayes was a skilled warrior, but he was older and outnumbered. He took a blade to the shoulder, protecting Lysandra, and she knew they could not win through combat alone. So she did the only thing she could think of. Lysandra raised her voice in command again, pouring every ounce of her will into it, and this time she targeted Victor specifically. "Submit," she commanded, and the word carried weight that should not have been possible for an Omega. Victor's knees buckled. His wolf, despite all his alpha strength, recognized the power in Lysandra's voice and responded with instinctive obedience. It lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Hayes grabbed Lysandra's hand and they ran. They burst from the caves with rogues in pursuit, but Hayes's horse was fast and Lysandra's weight was slight. They rode through the night, pushing hard, the ledger secure in Lysandra's pack, and Hayes's blood soaking through his shirt. When they finally saw the palace walls as dawn broke, Lysandra nearly wept with relief. Dominic met them at the gates, and the look on his face when he saw Lysandra bloodied and exhausted nearly broke her heart. He pulled her from her horse and into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Never again," he said into her hair, his voice breaking. "Never again, Lysandra." But she had done it. She had retrieved the ledger, saved Hayes, and identified the head traitor. When they opened the ledger in the war room, surrounded by guards and trusted advisors, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Names upon names detailed records of treason spanning 15 years. And at the top of the most recent entries, clear as day, Lord Victor Ashford, conspiracy to commit treason, murder of Queen Luna Ironheart. Dominic's world shattered as he read those words. Victor had been his mentor, the man who had taught him to be king, who had advised him through the hardest years of his life. And he had murdered Dominic's mother. The rage that filled the Alpha King in that moment was terrible to behold. His hands shook as he gripped the ledger, his breathing harsh, his wolf howling for vengeance. But when Lysandra placed her small hand over his where it gripped the ancient book, he looked at her and saw steadiness, wisdom, strength. Justice, she said quietly, not vengeance. There is a difference. Dominic pulled her close, needing her touch to anchor him. How are you so wise? He asked roughly. How do you always know exactly what I need to hear? 'Cause I see you. Lysandra replied simply. All of you, the king and the man, and I am not afraid of either. That night, after Hayes had been tended by the healers and the ledger secured in the royal vault, Dominic came to Lysandra's chambers. This time when he entered, there was no hesitation in his movements, no careful distance. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. I thought I lost you, he said roughly. When you rode out those gates, I thought my heart would stop, and I realized that pushing you away was not protecting either of us. It was just making us both miserable. Then stop pushing, Lysandra said, looking up at him. Let me in, Dominic, all the way in. He lowered his head and claimed her lips in a kiss that sealed their fate. The connection between them snapped fully into place with the force of a lightning strike. Lysandra gasped against Dominic's mouth as power and emotion flooded through their bond in waves that threatened to drown them both. She felt his strength, his protectiveness, his desperate loneliness that was finally being healed. And Dominic felt her gentleness, her resilient hope, her capacity for love that had survived despite all the rejection she had endured. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, both transformed by what they had just experienced, Lysandra saw tears tracking through the dirt on Dominic's face. Mine, he said, his wolf surging forward with possessive satisfaction. Yours, Lysandra agreed, then added with a small smile. And you are mine too, Alphaking. Just Dominic, he corrected, pulling her close despite the exhaustion in every line of his body. When we are alone, I am just Dominic, just your mate. They held each other through the night, and for the first time since Dominic had become king, he slept peacefully, his mate safe in his arms, and his heart finally whole. The formal announcement of their intended bonding came 3 days after Lysandra and Hayes returned with the ledger. But first there was the matter of Lord Victor Ashford's trial. The Grand Hall was packed with representatives from every pack in the kingdom, nobles and warriors standing shoulder to shoulder to witness justice. Victor stood in chains before the throne, his expression one of cold defiance rather than remorse. Dominic sat on the throne with Marcus on one side and Lysandra on the other, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The prodigal father returned, the Omega who had saved him, and the king who was finally allowing himself to love. Lord Victor Ashford. Dominic's voice rang through the hall. You stand accused of treason against the crown conspiracy to commit murder and the death of Queen Luna Ironheart. How do you answer these charges? Guilty, Victor said, without hesitation. And I would do it all again. A ripple of shock ran through the assembled crowd. You admit to murdering my mother? Dominic's voice was ice. I admit to doing what was necessary, Victor replied. Your mother made Marcus weak. She turned a strong king into a lovesick fool who put his Omega mate above the kingdom's needs. I thought her death would forge him into a proper ruler again. When he ran instead, I knew you would need different shaping. So you orchestrated attacks on our people, manipulated our defenses, sold information to our enemies. I did what was required to make you strong, Victor said coldly. And it worked, did it not? You became a feared and respected king. But now you are making the same mistake your father made. He gestured dismissively at Lysandra. You put an Omega above your duty. You will destroy everything I built. The hall erupted in anger, warriors shouting for Victor's blood nobles, demanding immediate execution. But Dominic raised his hand for silence. You call it weakness to value life, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. To choose mercy when vengeance would be easier. To believe that a king serves his people rather than ruling through fear. But I have learned something from my mate from the Omega you dismiss so easily. Dominic stood, moving to stand beside Lysandra. True strength is knowing when to fight and when to heal, when to punish and when to show mercy. You believe power comes only from dominance, from fear, from blood. But you are wrong. The strongest kingdoms are built on trust, on honor, on bonds of loyalty freely given. For your crimes against the crown, for the murder of Queen Luna, for 15 years of treason and manipulation, I could execute you here and now, Many in this hall are calling for your death. Dominic's gray eyes were hard as steel. But I will not give you the easy escape of a quick death. Instead, I sentence you to exile. You will be stripped of your title and lands marked as traitor and cast beyond our borders. If you ever set foot in our territory again, the sentence will be death. The hall erupted again, this time in debate. Some called for harsher punishment, arguing that exile was too merciful. But others, especially the warriors who had come to respect Lysandra, understood the wisdom in the decision. Living with his failure will be worse than death for a man like him, Commander Hayes said loudly. And this way we show that our kingdom is changing, that we choose wisdom over wrath when we can. Victor was dragged away, his face twisted with fury and impotent rage. And as he disappeared through the doors, Lysandra felt Dominic's hand find hers and squeeze gently. "Thank you," he murmured, "for showing me there was another way." In the weeks that followed, the conspiracy was systematically dismantled. 6 more traitors were identified, from the ledger tried and sentenced. The kingdom was purged of the rot that had been eating at it for 15 years, and in the process something shifted in how the Pax viewed their young king. He was not just a warrior anymore. He was a leader who balanced strength with wisdom, who listened to counsel from unexpected sources, who valued justice over vengeance. And beside him, quietly transforming the kingdom in ways both large and small, was Lysandra. She established healing centers in territories that had been damaged by the rogue attacks, training Omegas in the healing arts her mother had taught her. She reformed laws that had oppressed Omegas for generations, giving them rights to own property, refuse unwanted mates, serve in pack councils. She worked with displaced families, helped rebuild communities, and used her gentle nature to comfort those who had lost loved ones. The kingdom watched their future Omega Queen with growing respect and affection, realizing that she was exactly the balance their king needed. The formal bonding ceremony took place on the winter solstice under a full moon that hung heavy and bright in the December sky. Lysandra wore a gown of silver and white that made her look like moonlight made flesh, and Dominic wore the formal regalia of the Alphaking, magnificent and regal. But when they exchanged the ritual bites that would mark them as bonded for life, when Dominic's teeth sank gently into the curve of Lysandra's neck, and her scent bloomed with the mark of her alpha, there was nothing formal or regal about it. There was only love, strong and true, and finally acknowledged. The celebration lasted 3 days, wolves from across the kingdom and beyond coming to pay their respects to their new queen. And to everyone's surprise, the rejected Omega, who had been deemed too weak to attend her own Pax choosing ceremony, greeted each visitor with grace and genuine warmth that won hearts everywhere she went. On the 4th day, as the last guest departed and the palace returned to its normal rhythm, Marcus found Lysandra in the library. "I wanted to thank you," he said, settling into a chair across from where she sat reading, "for everything you have given us, for saving my life, yes, but more than that, for saving my son's heart. He was becoming hard, closed off, more king than man. You brought him back to himself." "He did the same for me," Lysandra replied softly. "I was lost when you found me, Marcus. Rejected and purposeless, and so lonely I could barely breathe. Dominic gave me a place to belong, a role that matters, a love that heals. You were both lost," Marcus said wisely, "and you found each other. That is how it works when the moon goddess gets it right." 6 months after their bonding, Lysandra discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, recognizing the signs from her healing training. But she wanted to be certain before telling Dominic, wanted the healers to confirm what her instincts already knew. When head healer Catherine smiled and nodded, Lysandra felt joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She told Dominic that evening in the privacy of their chambers, watching his face transform from surprise to wonder to fierce, overwhelming joy. "You are certain?" he asked, his hands already moving protectively to her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a pup, we are," Lysandra confirmed, her own eyes bright with happy tears. Dominic swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. Then he set her down carefully, his expression shifting to intense protectiveness. "Nothing will harm you or our child," he vowed. "I swear it on my life." "I know," Lysandra said, touching his face gently. "But you also need to trust that I am not fragile. I can handle what comes. We will face it together." The pregnancy was healthy, and Lysandra refused to be treated like delicate crystal. She continued her work with the healing centers and pack reforms well into her 6th month, much to Dominic's consternation. When he tried to convince her to rest more, she simply smiled and reminded him that Omega females had been having pups while working for thousands of years. In her seventh month, remnants of Victor's network made one final attempt to destabilize the kingdom. An assassin infiltrated the palace intent on killing the pregnant Omega Queen and throwing the realm into chaos. He found Lysandra in her study reviewing requests from various packs. The assassin never stood a chance. Lysandra sensed him before he struck her Omega instincts, screaming warning. When he lunged, she spoke a single word in that voice of command she had used in the caves at Blackstone Ridge. Stop. The assassin froze mid-strike, his wolf responding to the ancient power in her voice despite his human will screaming at him to complete the kill. Guards burst through the door seconds later, having heard the commotion, and found their queen standing over a frozen attacker, her hand protectively on her swollen belly. I believe this one has information we need, Lysandra said calmly. Take him to the dungeons. I will question him myself, my queen. One of the guards protested. You should not. I am perfectly capable of interrogating a prisoner, Lysandra interrupted. And I am the one he tried to kill. I have earned the right. When Dominic heard what had happened, he nearly lost his mind with fear and fury. But when he burst into the dungeons, he found Lysandra extracting a full confession from the assassin, her voice calm and her questions precise. She had identified the last three conspirators in the location of their safe house, all without violence, using nothing but her Omega abilities and her sharp mind. Dominic pulled her into his arms the moment she finished holding her so tightly she had to remind him about the baby. You terrify me, he said roughly. You are 7 months pregnant, and you just captured and interrogated an assassin. I am not helpless, Lysandra replied. I am an Omega, yes, but I am also your queen, your mate, and the mother of your child. I am stronger than I look. I know, Dominic said, pressing his forehead to hers. I know, but allow me some fear for your safety. You are my entire world, and you are mine, Lysandra said softly, which is why I will always fight to stay in it. On a night when the full moon hung heavy and bright in the winter sky, 7 months after Lysandra had discovered her pregnancy, she went into labor. It began as a dull ache during the evening meal, so subtle she almost dismissed it. But when the pain sharpened an hour later, wrapping around her middle like an iron band, she knew. Dominic, she said quietly, reaching for his hand, it is time. The Alphaking, who had faced armies without flinching, went absolutely white. The birth was long and difficult, as first births often are. The healers said the pup was large, positioned awkwardly, and Lysandra's small Omega frame struggled with the delivery. Hours passed in waves of pain that made her cry out despite her determination to stay strong. Dominic refused to leave her side. He held her hand through every contraction, wiped sweat from her forehead, whispered encouragement when she was certain she could not continue. I cannot do this, Lysandra gasped during a particularly brutal wave of pain. Dominic, I cannot. You can, he said with absolute conviction, his voice breaking. You are the strongest person I know. You saved my father. You retrieved the ledger. You became queen. You faced down an assassin while carrying our child. You can do this. In the hallway outside, Marcus paced with Commander Hayes and several senior healers, listening to his daughter-in-law's cries and remembering when Luna had given birth to Dominic. The same fear, the same helpless waiting. Inside the birthing chamber near dawn, there was a moment of crisis. The pup's heartbeat faltered. Head healer Catherine looked at Dominic with grave eyes. We may have to choose, she said quietly, between the queen and the child. Dominic's world stopped. His hands tightened on Lysandra's. Save her, he said without hesitation, his voice raw. Whatever happens, save her. I cannot lose her. But Lysandra heard him through the haze of pain and exhaustion. No, she managed. Save us both. I did not survive this long to give up now. And something in her voice, that stubborn determination that had carried her through rejection and loneliness and war, resonated through the room. She closed her eyes, reached deep for the healing gift her mother had passed down, and pushed with everything she had. Her healing ability flared to life, not just for wounds, but for birth itself, easing the way, giving her body the strength it needed. When their son finally emerged with a lusty cry that echoed through the birthing chamber, Dominic was openly weeping with relief and joy and overwhelming love. He is perfect, Lysandra breathed, as the healers cleaned their son and placed him in her arms. Absolutely perfect. The baby had Dominic's black hair and Lysandra's blue eyes, and from the moment he drew breath, he radiated strength, tempered with gentleness, the perfect balance of his parents. Marcus entered the room, took one look at his grandson, and tears streamed down his face. "He is beautiful," the old king whispered. "Luna would have been so proud." "What should we name him?" Lysandra asked, exhausted but radiant with joy. Dominic touched his son's tiny hand, marveling, when miniature fingers wrapped around one of his. "Thomas," he said, meeting his father's eyes. "Thomas Marcus Ironheart, if you approve." Marcus could not speak for a moment, too overcome with emotion. "I am honored," he finally managed. "More honored than I can say." They called him Tommy from the beginning. He was a happy, healthy pup who grew strong and bright under the watchful eyes of his parents and grandfather. Dominic was a devoted father, spending hours with his son, despite his responsibilities as king, determined to be present in a way his own father had not been able to be. The kingdom prospered under Dominic and Lysandra's joint rule. Her compassion balanced his strength, her wisdom tempered his intensity. Together, they created a realm where Omegas were protected and valued, where justice was balanced with mercy, where the old ways of pure dominance gave way to partnership and mutual respect. On Tommy's first birthday, a celebration was held that drew wolves from across the kingdom and beyond. The palace was transformed into a wonderland of decorations, and the sounds of joy echoed through every hall. As evening fell, Lysandra stood on the palace balcony, watching the festivities spread out below. Dominic came to stand beside her, their son balanced on his hip. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Impossibly so," Lysandra replied, leaning into his warmth. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life, that I went from being rejected and alone to having everything I could ever want. You deserved all of this and more," Dominic said with conviction. "Your pack were fools who will spend the rest of their lives regretting how they treated you. You are the finest queen this kingdom has ever known, the most wonderful mate I could have asked for, and the most loving mother our son could have. And you," Lysandra countered, rising on her toes to kiss him softly, "are the king who saw past what everyone else dismissed. The alpha who taught me I was strong, the mate who completed me, the father who will teach our son to be both powerful and kind, just like you." Mama Tommy babbled, reaching for Lysandra with chubby hands. "Dada." They both laughed, and Dominic passed their son to Lysandra, watching with love as she cuddled him close. Marcus appeared on the balcony to join them, looking years younger than when Lysandra had first found him bleeding in the forest. He had found peace and purpose again, was actively involved in his grandson's life, and had become an invaluable advisor to both Dominic and Lysandra. "A family," Marcus said softly, looking at the three of them. "I thought I had lost this, that I would spend my remaining years alone, wandering without purpose. But you found me, Lysandra, and in saving me, you saved all of us." "I think we saved each other," Lysandra replied, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "That is what family does." As the celebration continued below and the full moon rose over the Appalachian Mountains, the four of them stood together on the balcony, a family forged by fate, strengthened by love, and bound together by ties that would last forever. Dominic looked at his father, his mate, and his son, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. 3 years ago, he had been alone, convinced he would never find his other half, slowly hardening into a ruler who knew only duty and responsibility. Now he had everything: love, family, purpose, and hope for the future. All because one rejected Omega had heard an old man's cries for help and chosen to answer, never knowing that in saving one lost soul, she would find her own salvation and change the destiny of an entire kingdom. In the forest clearing where Lysandra had first found Marcus, wildflowers bloomed year-round now, as if blessed by the moon goddess herself. Wolves who passed that spot felt a sense of peace and rightness, as if fate had touched the ground there and left its mark. And in the kingdom where the rejected became queen, where the broken found healing, where love conquered fear, they built a legacy that would endure forever. Not through dominance alone, but through the perfect balance of strength and compassion, warrior and healer, king and queen. Years passed and Tommy grew strong and wise, learning from his parents and grandfather. More children were born to Dominic and Lysandra. A daughter with her mother's pale hair and her father's gray eyes, another son who had his grandmother Luna's gentle spirit and his grandfather Marcus's tactical mind. The kingdom faced new challenges and new triumphs, but through it all, the foundation of love and partnership that Dominic and Lysandra had built remained unshaken. And sometimes on quiet nights when the moon was full, Dominic would tell his children the story of how their parents met, how a rejected Omega had shown kindness to a lost old man, never knowing that simple act of compassion would change the course of destiny itself. Remember, Dominic would always conclude holding his children close. That strength comes in many forms. Your mother's gentleness is every bit as powerful as my ability to command. True strength is knowing when to fight and when to heal, when to lead with authority and when to listen with compassion. The greatest leaders are those who understand that power without heart is tyranny, but compassion without courage is weakness. And the children, looking between their devoted father and their wise, gentle mother, understood that they had been given the greatest gift any child could receive. Parents who embodied both sides of strength, who loved each other completely, and who would teach them to be whole rather than merely powerful. As the years turned into decades, the story of the rejected Omega who became queen was told throughout the kingdom and beyond. A tale of hope and transformation that reminded everyone that sometimes the people society deems weakest are exactly the ones destiny has been preparing for greatness. And in the royal chambers of the palace where Dominic and Lysandra grew old together, their love never diminished but only deepened, becoming more precious with each passing year. They had found each other when both were lost, had built a life of purpose and meaning together, and had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was in every sense a love story for the ages, strong and gentle, powerful and tender, destined and true. And it all began with one simple act of kindness on a cold autumn night when a rejected Omega heard a cry for help and chose to answer, never knowing that in saving one lost soul she would find her own salvation and transform a kingdom.